At the end of any major battle that occurs in history comes the unenviable task of interring the dead. For the town of Gettysburg, that was astronomical feat. There were 7,000 dead Americans once this battle concluded, not counting the many more wounded that were laying in the streets and in the houses and across the fields of Adams County, Pennsylvania. The catastrophe that this battle essentially was for the town was so great that ideas were put together that maybe there should be a national cemetery to inter all of the Union dead into one location. And that's where we are today in this edition of Retracing History. We are at the National Cemetery at Gettysburg National Military Park, the first Soldiers National Cemetery put together by the United States. Let's go check it out.
When the fighting ended on July 3rd, 1863, the Union Army of the Potomac found themselves in the unfamiliar role of having possession of the field. They had won a great victory, but it was up to them to bury the dead, and also had to contend with pursuing the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia out of Pennsylvania. By the following week, the burial details that consisted of soldiers and civilians alike worked as fast as they could to bury the horrific sights that dotted the landscape. But the hasty way this was achieved only prolonged the grim sights that haunted Gettysburg. Rainfall eroded the thin layers of dirt covering the corpses, leading to farm animals feasting upon the remains. The town's primary cemetery, which had only been established a few years prior to the battle, was seen as a possible location for the final resting place of the battlefield dead. Elizabeth Thorne, wife of the caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery, returned to her family's residence within the gatehouse on July 7th to find vestiges of the July 2nd assault on Cemetery Hill strewn amongst the headstones. Although she was 6 months pregnant with her fourth child, the superintendent of the cemetery ordered her to bury as many of the dead as possible. Attempts by townspeople to assist Mrs. Thorne were thwarted by the stench of the corpses. Thorne and her aged father succeeded in burying 91 graves, their progress impeded by the rocky soil on the graveyard. Mrs. Thorne's child would be born in the fall of 1863 and was often noted to be of ill health, a consequence of the strain her mother endured burying the dead. At the time, Mrs. Thorne's experiences were not recognized. It would only be 139 years later that her efforts became commemorated with a monument outside the gatehouse. It was apparent that a far larger effort would be required to give some of the dead a proper burial. Luckily for the people of Gettysburg, many in higher power agreed so. Originally, the governors of Union states had appointed agents to head to Gettysburg and organize the removal of their respective deceased, but achieving this would be too enormous of a task. Several agents, including Pennsylvania's agent, David Wills, began considering reinterring the dead in one large cemetery. When Wills proposed the idea to Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, he was quickly given approval to sort out how this could be achieved. Wills was able to achieve this in part by having connections with both entities out of state and within Gettysburg, for Wills was a well-established lawyer in town. Wills was successful in raising the necessary funds from various states and individuals to purchase property adjacent to the Evergreen Cemetery along the western slope of Cemetery Hill. The committee for this soldiers' cemetery hired William Saunders to produce the design. Saunders created a burial ground not yet seen in the United States, but would become a template for future national military cemeteries. The graves remain today as Saunders envisioned them, being laid in a semicircle divided amongst 22 sections. This represented the 18 Union states that fought at Gettysburg, as well as the United States regulars, and 3 sections of unidentified remains. The remains of officers were not to be separated from the average enlisted man. The graves are centered upon the 60-foot-tall granite Soldiers' National Monument. Wooden markers were originally used until the funds were raised for curbed stone that fan out across the cemetery. In 1935, the Civilian Conservation Corps would regrade the entire terrain over the graves to make maintenance simpler. This raised the grass to be flush with the markers. To bring the bodies to the new cemetery, the lowest bidder was rewarded with the contract for the task. A Mr. Beisker is listed as having received the contract, promising to deliver a body at the rate of $1.59. Beisker would hire about a dozen men from the community to do the physical labor. Notable among them was Basil Biggs, a local veterinarian who rented out a farm west of town. Like many, he found his property ravaged by war and needed a means of reimbursement. Biggs used his own wagon for the task of delivering coffins to the site of the exhumations, then would haul approximately 10 at a time back to the site of the cemetery. Mr. Wills hired Samuel Weaver, a retired photographer in town, to identify the corpses to the best of his ability. Weaver searched the pockets of the dead for any identification, as well as examining their undergarments for initials. Confederates that were recovered were reburied on the battlefield in unmarked trenches. Union dead would have an identification tacked on a headboard that laid upon a coffin. The process of exhumation, identification, and reburial was set to begin in August of 1863, but the humid weather pushed back operations to the autumns of 1863 and 1864. 3,354 bodies were ultimately reinterred at Gettysburg's National Cemetery. But in November of 1863, only a third of that number were resting in peace. But satisfied with the progress of 100 bodies being interred a day, Mr. Wills proposed to have a dedication ceremony. He contacted one of America's most noteworthy orators, Edward Everett. Everett had served 4 terms as governor of Massachusetts, United States Secretary of State, and United States Senator, to name a few of his titles. But his tenure as a professor of Greek literature at Harvard likely spurred him into having the gift of gab in the mid-19th century of the United States of America. Everett was honored by the request to speak at the new cemetery, but could not make it until November 19, 1863. Wills made the necessary accommodation, and the dedication was on. On the night of November 18th, another guest of honor arrived for the dedication. Mr. Wills invited President Abraham Lincoln to the services, hoping he would conclude the ceremony with a few appropriate remarks. Much has been said of the president's ride by rail from Washington, D.C. to Gettysburg, it being rumored he passed the journey penning early drafts of his speech. The president would spend the night at Mr. Wills' house, a brick structure that was established on the town square in 1816. Today, any visitor to Gettysburg can tour Mr. Wills' law office and home, where he worked diligently upon the erection of the National Cemetery. It was that night the president put together his appropriate remarks for the dedication the following morning. On November 19, 1863, thousands gathered upon Cemetery Hill. A temporary wooden platform was established for the guests of honor. From the stage, Everett delivered a 2-hour speech about the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg in the ongoing Civil War. He would be followed by President Lincoln's now famous 271 words that acted as a rallying cry to continue the war to ensure those deceased soldiers being honored would not die in vain. The site is now grandly marked by the Soldiers' National Monument. No? Okay, I'm being told the monument in fact does not mark the site of the speeches. Okay, how about this elegant rostrum? After all, both Roosevelts have given speeches here. Alright, so this bust of the president denotes the spot, right? No! You're telling me nobody knows where one of the most famous speeches of the 19th century delivered, on one of the most well-documented battlefields, mind you. Of course, I'm exaggerating my rage, but one of the most common questions a visitor has at Gettysburg is where the Gettysburg Address was delivered. One must understand that Everett was who everyone had come out to hear that day. Lincoln was a late addition to the lineup. While Everett himself praised the president's address, it wasn't until after the war that people began to look fondly at the words he hallowed the fields of Gettysburg with. But, thanks to historians studying the few photographs available from the dedication ceremony, it is believed that the platform would have in fact resided on property of the Evergreen Cemetery. Keep in mind that wrought iron fence is a post-war feature. I've even heard one historian mark the site of the platform where the headstones with the fingers are in his photograph. Although Wills, Weaver, and Biggs and their team of laborers tried their best to provide some sort of identification to the dead, the remains of 979 soldiers were labeled as unknown. Each unidentified grave is denoted with a white square stone. Although the bulk of the work was finished by 1864, burials would sporadically continue as previously unrecorded graves were discovered on the battlefield. The most recent burial for an American Civil War soldier occurred in 1996 when a track crew working within the infamous railroad cut unearthed human remains, the allegiance of which could not be determined. One could spend several days visiting the graves and discovering the stories behind everyone who rests peacefully here. One of the curious names you'll come across is that of George Nixon. If you're wondering, does Mr. Nixon have any relation to President Nixon? Yes. George Nixon was Richard Nixon's great-grandfather, who enlisted with Company B of the 73rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. On July 2, 1863, the 73rd were in fact located on the hillside that would become Gettysburg's National Cemetery. The Union soldiers positioned on West Cemetery Hill were taking constant skirmish fire from Confederates on the southwestern edge of town. While on skirmish duty, Mr. Nixon took a bullet to the right side of his abdomen. After laying for a time on the field crying out in pain, one of the company's musicians, Richard Enderlane, ran out into no man's land and succeeded in pulling Nixon back into Union lines. Mr. Enderlane would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his act of bravery many years later, although Nixon succumbed to his wounds on July 14th. Delaware may not be a state synonymous with the American Civil War, but they do have a small plot of 15 identified remains at Gettysburg National Cemetery. Amongst those buried here is Thomas Paynter Carey. He enlisted with his brothers in the 1st Delaware Regiment in September of 1861. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Mr. Carey and his brother Woolsey both suffered wounds. Mr. Carey was not as fortunate on July 3rd, 1863. His regiment was situated along the Cemetery Ridge when 12,500 Confederate soldiers assaulted that position. The 1st Delaware were instrumental in holding the Union line against Pickett's charge, but Mr. Carey would die in the arms of his brother John. John Carey would not be long for this world either, being killed in action the following May. Pennsylvania is second only to New York for the state that suffered the greatest numerical casualties at the Battle of Gettysburg. Amongst those from the Keystone State whose remains rest here is Benjamin L. Schlaubbach. Schlaubbach and the rest of the men of the 153rd Pennsylvania enlisted with the understanding they would only be serving 90 days. Schlaubbach found himself in the unfortunate position of standing upon Blocker's Knoll, north of town, on July 1st, 1863. Confederates of the Corps, once commanded by Thomas Stonewall Jackson, crashed over that knoll, leaving Schlaubbach gravely wounded in their wake. Being treated by doctors from both sides, he would ultimately die August 1st, 1863. While William Saunders' plan set the graves to be commemorated equally, that did not stop monuments from dotting the cemetery's skyline. The first monument to go up in the cemetery was not the Soldiers' National Monument, but rather a granite plant urn. It was dedicated by veterans of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, a regiment that suffered the highest percentage of casualties at Gettysburg. The urn has stood watch over the graves of the boys from the land of 10,000 lakes since 1867, making it one of, if not the very first monument on the battlefield. While walking these hallowed grounds, one will be surprised to find graves dated in the 20th century. Veterans, as well as casualties from the Spanish-American War, the World Wars, and Vietnam are also interred at the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Most of these graves are marked with individual headstones, with several spouses sharing these plots. The most significant period of burials since the Civil War occurred between 1947 and 48. In the wake of the Second World War, over 500 American soldiers were interred at Gettysburg. Kin of those who fell received a questionnaire of where they wanted their loved one buried. The initial responses calling for burials at Gettysburg was so overwhelming, a 600 grave limit had to be placed upon this cemetery. A trained eye will recognize several of the dates on the headstones, including multiple casualties from Pearl Harbor and D-Day. But there was one grave that caught my attention, for I knew what that date meant. Frederick Clark was ranked Private First Class in the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Clark was used to cold winters of western Pennsylvania, not of Belgium. But on December 17th, he found himself amongst a convoy barreling from Almaty to St. Vith via Bogness. It was the opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge, the German counteroffensive into the Ardennes. The escape route of Clark and several others in the 285th was cut off by an SS column. Clark surrendered to German soldiers, but instead of being escorted to the rear, he was thrown amongst 100 of his comrades and mowed down by machine gun fire. At least 84 of the 285th were massacred that day, with Clark being one of the first to fall. Initially buried in France, the Clark family requested that Frederick be reinterred upon the most hallowed grounds in his home state. At present, there are 6,000 graves housed within Gettysburg National Cemetery. The efforts by those who designed, funded, and constructed the cemetery would lay the blueprint for how soldiers who perished for the United States of America would be given a proper final burial.
So, you can tell I'm not as chirpy as I normally can be, and for obvious reasons. We have just walked through hallowed grounds. There are 6,000 graves here, as I mentioned in the video. Civil War, Spanish-American War, First and Second World War, and even Vietnam, with soldiers from other time periods in between. So, if you do get the chance, before you leave, if you visit Gettysburg, before you leave, be sure to pay your respects at the Soldiers National Cemetery of Gettysburg to try to grasp the true scope of loss that this battle created. And hopefully we never repeat it. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time.